Okay, maybe the microphone would help, huh? This will be a relatively short one. I have actually an incoming request that I need to take care of. So what I basically want to do before we actually dive into further developing here our structure is kind of addressing some kind of repetitive things that we sometimes feel are an issue. So as far as you remember, and again, if you don't have, just feel free to get that from GitHub. I will link it down in the description. Actually, I will do that right now. Give me a second. Let me see where I have that. Yeah, that one. So feel free to pull that down. I'm going to post it right here in the chat. So wherever you are, this should basically pop up in all platforms. Switch over quickly and see if that's the case. Yeah, so you see that over here, and that should be fine. Now, what we basically have, if you look at what we have so far, are models, views, and controllers, right? The views are relatively simple. I mean, we are using really just straightforward basic HTML, right? So let's just close all for now. So the more interesting point is, of course, like, okay, so what is up with those controllers, right? So we have an about controller, we have a post controller, and we have a PHP controller. A home controller, and a post controller. Now, as we can see, we haven't finished this one here. Okay, let's look at those two maybe. There are a couple of things that are kind of repetitive, right? So apparently, this is something that we need to do every time. And when we forget, then it's kind of hard to debug because we will not kind of figure out what exactly the problem is. So there are a couple ways to do that. What I'm going to do right now is to say I'm going to create a new file that I basically call controller. And, oops, sorry. Should cancel that. Create a new PHP file. I'm going to call controller. And what this PHP file will be doing, and let's actually create a new branch for that, and call that abstraction, right? And I'm going to create a abstract class here, okay, that I'm going to be calling controller. And it's going to have the same namespace. Okay. And in this class, I will define a couple of things. So I will, for example, define that there is a public view. That's simply what needs to happen. I'm also going to say, hey, this has a function construct. That will actually do nothing in that case. Okay, so let's just see if we just say like, hey, every class extends controller. Okay, so missing parent constructor call. Okay, so this is, maybe we don't want to go that far. I'm going to show you interfaces with the models. So what we do know now is, to see how this says not necessary anymore, right? So all of a sudden I have this view is something that is available. See that? Regardless of whether or not I have it defined. So here, this just looks like fine and dandy. If I were to not do that, to see how it says like, hey, this is implicitly declared, right? This does not look nice. But here we have this view, so this view will definitely exist, right? So we could even say like, hey, how about, since it's just a string, no view set in controller. If we were to do that, then it would exist regardless, right? So let's just assume that we would not have this, right? And then visit this page. Then you would see that it says no view set in controller. So it would basically understand that, hey, this view is not overwritten. So we now have, if we forget, to do that, but while we're working, we can basically see what, or at least have an indication of what the problem is, right? And we can be more specific with that if we want to. But I want to keep this really, really simple. So putting that back in, and then we see everything is fine, right? So that's a little bit what we want to do. So the only rule that we then have to basically decide on is to say, okay, so every controller extends controller. And that's all we need to do. And then basically going forward, our controllers extends controller. And you can see this will not be necessary anymore. And it will basically work just fine. Now in the models, let's look at how our models look like. So can you imagine what the advantage of such a pattern is? In our models, let's look at that. So we have a post model. We also have a public post ID, and we will probably have different models too. So in order to work with models on a way that is predictable, we kind of expect a couple of things to be there, right? We expect it to have, for example, a find function. Every model should have this. And if a developer creates a new model, it must fulfill that format. So in order to achieve that, the easiest way is to basically say, well, how about if we kind of make this somewhat mandatory? So another way that we can influence such a thing is to say, okay, so I'm going to have a model. And yes, I want to add that to Git. And that has the namespace, is it models? Yeah, models. And now I'm defining an interface that I'm also going to call model. Okay, so an interface is basically something where I say, hey, I'm going to dictate what you need. Okay, so I can now basically, okay, static function, what was our pattern? Find. Okay, so if I create an interface like that, I basically say like, hey, this every class of models requires a static function find. So let's see that out. Check that out. Now here I'm going to say implements model. Okay, and now you can see this little marker over here. And what that's doing is basically saying like, okay, should we, I mean, here now we have it, right? But if I, for example, say like, okay, this does not exist, then you can see this is red. Class must be declared abstract or implement method find, right? So this needs to be a model find. So if I put it in again, I have basically the possibility to say, okay, now all works fine. Should I make a mistake and, for example, forget that it's static, right? It's also going to say no. And this will, if you don't have an IDE that does that, by the way, so let me see posts. Let's just assume that we're actually running this in our Chrome. So this really like just will not work, right? It will tell you exactly what the issue is. So you need to follow this pattern now and say, okay, so it's a static function find. And this prevents you from so many problems because if we can guarantee that every model has a function find that's static, then the way we write it, and I think it was here, right, where we say get posts, yeah, post find, you know, we can basically say, okay, whatever it is, right, whether it's posts or users or models or whatever, this function find will exist. And therefore, you're gonna force yourself to a very, very clean structure in a very, very predictable format. And that's basically what the simple structure is, right? So you would normally have in more complicated frameworks basically an abstract class that again implements an interface, and then basically use it on your actual classes. But let's ignore that for now. We want to keep it, simple and basically just come to the same conclusions that modern frameworks come to with very, very simple considerations. And of course, like we have now simplified it down so far that you can actually start wondering, like, okay, why do I even need this, right? If it's that simple, can I not simply say, hey, let's do it like that? And of course you can, right? So now you basically say, hey, I'm using this view, and I'm just going to put my all of my posts in there, and that's literally all that's required at this point, right? And then let's look at our home. See, and it is right how we want it to be. I mean, it's pretty ugly right now, but you get the point. Yeah, that's a little bit of a short update. Again, a little bit of a change of plans. I am going to make a comparison on a front-end decision pretty soon, because I'm working a lot with React lately with students, and I personally prefer Vue.js, so I'm going to compare those two frameworks in probably next week. We will see whenever I have time for that. I want to finish that one first here because we still have a lot to do when it comes to setting up our general structure. So for those who are new, so the basic idea is to say, well, we're going to create a very, very simple application that we will then use as a boilerplate to basically work with clean code, if that is something that makes sense to you, because I know that in the past, or how you've probably learned how to use PHP is vastly different from how you should actually write PHP. Well, that's basically all. Thank you so much for watching, and again, sorry for this short episode here, but I have something that I need to attend to, and I will probably get back to you guys later this afternoon. See you soon.